even in somebody's 20s or 30s, being like 70 pounds overweight, we talk about this as like, but my blood work looks fine. And so I'm healthy and I love myself and this and that. It's like, yeah, but the rate that that's going to decline is going to happen so much faster. Even your best selling brands in the United States are pretty shoddy compared to what they're advertising. Carbohydrates are great. People shouldn't be afraid of them. It's just you need to time them where you need them. The reason I say it's sad that it's taken this long is because there's been such a stigma associated with TRT that was never associated with things like estrogen replacement therapy, which has been a big deal. The reason that's taken so long to get popularized is that when estrogen replacement has been a big deal for like, over 20 years now.
There's a TikTok trend. I don't know how much you look at TikTok, but there's the Tren challenge on TikTok where these 16, 17 teenagers are taking Tren for like a month and seeing how much muscle they can put on. And it's like
that stuff's so stupid because
are you familiar with Bryan Johnson at all? Awesome. And I guess we'll just go ahead and kick it off. And for the viewers, Brad, can you kind of give a walkthrough of your background and do some of your experience and what you're kind of working on today as well, maybe?
Yeah. So I was when I was in undergrad, I was a kines student. And I had a minor in biology. I was always interested in training. I was also played football when I was in college, and I was always interested in training. I think there's a lot of folks who when they play sports, you have two categories of people. You have people who are like just as into the training part as they are into like actually playing the sport, and then you have kind of the other side where it's like they love the sport so much that they know training is something they just kind of got to go through to do it. And they're not necessarily just, fascinated by doing that, but I always have been. And so when I kind of got to the end of my undergrad degree, where I was, my intentions were just be not that there's anything wrong with this at all, was, to coach and teach at like a high school somewhere. And then I went and did an internship at NASA, and their kind of their exercise physiology program and things like that. And then so got interested in that. So I decided to go ahead and take my GRE, and then went and did a PhD at Texas A&M in kinesiology. The area that I focused on there was skeletal muscle metabolism, human responses to exercise training. And then at the time, I was really interested in this idea of what a lot of people refer to as the interference effect. So this idea of like, why can't I train aerobically for endurance and train for strength and kind of maximize both? Where you start looking at the processes that really govern, specialization in training. Like, for example, it would be a terrible idea to take a champion marathon runner and then put them on, a heavy weight training program like 4 days a week while they're sitting, while they're eating an excess amount of calories, because they'll become inefficient. They'll become less good at that skill. At the same time, it would be a bad idea for me to take, like, say, a 100-meter dash champ and go and make them run miles and miles and miles and miles, or put them on the stair climber all the time, or do those, because it'll slow them down. It'll make the muscle adapt in a way that won't be good for performance. So that was kind of an area that we were looking at, and found that a lot of it isn't, those aren't just hard set rules. There's a big spectrum of how you adapt to exercise. So we started looking at a lot of things like what are different modes that allow you to recover but get kind of some of the same benefits. So we looked at things like underwater treadmill running and things like that. And through that process, got integrated with things like taking muscle samples from people and looking at things. We see it all the time. You see it on the side of your protein cans all the time, measuring muscle protein synthesis, where we do what's called isotope labeling, where somebody either consumes or is injected with labeled amino acids or things that make their way into muscle. And if you know how much you gave someone, you know how much ends up in the blood, and you know how much ends up in the muscle over time, you can calculate what the rate of growth is or what the rate of decay is. And then measuring things like just signaling inside a muscle that contributes to the responses of how you adapt. So at the same time, nutrition started becoming a bigger interest of mine. So I went and did a postdoctoral fellowship after I finished my PhD at UT Medical Branch in Galveston. I was in the Department of Nutrition and Metabolism. We were actually looking at how different nutrient sources can affect anabolism and catabolism in both older and younger adults. At the time, one thing we were looking at was this thing called anabolic resistance, like why, as we age, do our bodies become less sensitive to anabolic stimuli? Like it takes a 70-year-old. Why does it take a 70-year-old twice as much protein in a given sitting to cause protein synthesis to happen as like somebody who's young? Why does it take different types of exercise stimulus? And then also, how does that all play with inflammation? And then but the issue is that we also looked at there is, older adults sometimes have like things like their kidneys might be compromised or their livers might be so just shoving protein into them might actually be a problem. So then it's like, what about protein? Are there specific amino acids that we can kind of isolate and give in small doses? Like if you're giving someone BCAAs or a certain combination of amino acids that cause muscle to grow and that are kind of like the prime stimulators of that. So right around the same time as that was all going on, a good buddy of mine who had always taught, who's an engineer, he works for Texas A&M. His name is Dr. Michael Marino. We had always kind of chatted back and forth about, it was kind of interesting that as much as in sport performance and whether it's sport performance, bodybuilding, nutrition, devices were starting to become like such a bigger and bigger thing. So like wearables, everybody's got like a Garmin, looking at biomechanics, looking at different things that if you go to a sports science center, all those things that they're using to evaluate athletes and stuff like that. Or in the weight room, different camera things that look at your mechanics and stuff like that. It's all engineers. It's all engineering. So we were always joking back then, how come engineers and kinesiology guys aren't working together more? And then at right around that time, he started a lab, or was starting a program at Houston Methodist Hospital here in Houston, which is one of the largest hospital systems in the biggest medical center in the world, where we work with everybody from youth athletes all the way up to college and pro athletes, up to like 70 and 80-year-olds getting their hips replaced. So it's in the Department of Orthopedics and Sports Medicine. So in orthopedics, we were thinking about things like maximizing somebody's rehab after they get injured. How do we get somebody back on track? How do we look at things like limb symmetry as somebody's loading? We also look at like, what are the factors about how someone moves that contributes to injury in different athlete populations? That might mean like, how does total distance run and nutrition and sleep all play into whether or not a cross-country runner is going to get a stress fracture? Or how does the way someone's pitching going to make them more likely to need Tommy John? Those kinds of things. How is somebody going to recover their quad muscle mass after we have to replace their knee? So that's a lot of what we do in here. And in the lab I work in now, we have it's a 6,000 square foot lab that has a 3D motion capture system in it, just like you see in the Marvel movies and all that. And then we also have metabolic carts for doing all the classic stuff like VO2 max and resting metabolic rates. We use a DEXA scanner for all of our body composition measurements. So it's and all of it kind of ties into each other. We have a nutrition control trial we're running right now to look at the effects of protein supplementation in athletes following ACL reconstruction. So it all kind of like plays together. I also have an adjunct position here in the Rice University. So it's interesting. So my lab is actually the hospital, the building that I technically work for and employed by, is right across the street over there. But my lab is sitting on Rice University campus, and so we have a lot of students and stuff as well. So Yeah, it's a wide range of publications. We work with a number of people. You see a lot of surgical stuff on there too, because we do a lot of things with our patients, looking at different studies like things to reduce opioid consumption following surgery, things that keep patients from getting infected. We also look at kind of risk indicators for whether someone should have surgery or not. So that's a lot of that's pretty much like the quick and dirty of it.
Yeah.
And then in terms of organizations we work with regularly, we work with the NFL on a lot of stuff. I work with Major League Baseball in particular on quite a few things. Most recently, a lot of the stuff involving like blood flow restriction therapy and all that kind of stuff. That's like kind of the hot buzz thing in not only sports, but seems to be every now and then you'll see it on like the bodybuilding forums and that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much what I do.
Quick in quotations, that's quite a bit. So unpacking a lot of that. So it seems as there's a huge focus on the practicality of recovery for all sorts of individuals. And one of the things that you kind of touched on that really piqued my interest was the degradation you were talking about in protein processing as individuals get older, and some of that is that correlated to their body? I know this is probably complex, but is a lot of that correlated to the fact that as you age, your body just becomes more inefficient as it gets older, or is some of that?
So that's still something we're trying to unpack. So there's a few things that affect like how you respond and how you grow, or catabolic processes. So and certainly someone who stays fit throughout their whole life and continues to exercise is going to experience less than that. Everybody's kind of going to decline. It's just whether or not you want to decline. Well, let me fix this background thing.
Okay,
it's whether or not you want to. It's whether or not you want to see like a decline like this, or whether you want to kind of see it, do that. And so things like obesity and overeating and things like that, essentially where you're kind of flooding your engine all the time, what that can do is that can really drive up things like reactive oxygen species, and that we hear about, and when we talk about that in the context of inflammation, and that causes things like insulin resistance, and where the older you are, that I'll put it this funny because we always get into it's like the old school science class where we talk about the importance of mitochondria. So how your muscle health is doing is highly dependent on your mitochondrial function, how it processes things. When it becomes unhealthy because somebody's constantly flooding their engine, or just or some sort of chronic disease, you have things that leak out of it that cause free radicals and cause damage, and all of that affects in the context of muscle, that causes a high amount of what's called of chronic inflammation. So these factors that get released, and it sends signals that make your muscle more pro-catabolic than anabolic. And so it almost takes to turn that around, almost takes twice the effort then. The problem that older adults deal with as well, they don't have the ability necessarily to exercise as hard. They're not going to be in there getting under the bar doing like 4 sets of 10 on a heavy back squat as much. So but you notice people who have kind of stuck with it their whole lives tend to be able to kind of hold that process off longer. So it's not like at a certain age everybody's stuff just goes to shit and they can't make use of these things, but it's one of those better to kind of be consistent with it from a young age than be like, say, somebody who lived a poor lifestyle all the way up till they were like 45 and then they decided, hey, I'm going to turn it around. Not to say people can't, but it just becomes way harder at that point. Like, even in somebody's 20s or 30s, being like 70 pounds overweight, we talk about this as like, but my blood work looks fine, and so I'm healthy and I love myself and this and that. It's like, yeah, but the rate that's going to decline is going to happen so much faster as a result of that. So that's kind of it's kind of what we deal with now. how that affects our patients and stuff that we deal with is it's like it's night and day. We'll have a patient who's been active their whole life, and maybe like 65, 70-year-old guy who just likes going golfing and likes, goes to the gym and does that. But maybe after he's been on the course for 2 or 3 hours, his knee's just throbbing so bad because he's got arthritis and he needs to get his knee replaced. That guy's going to recover by 3 to 6 months. They'll be doing okay. It's still going to be hard. They'll still be rehabbing. That's different than, say, the person who's had poor nutrition their whole life and they're like, now they're kind of overweight as a result of this, that, and the other. Now they have to get a knee replaced, and for whatever reason in their mind they think that's the thing that's going to turn it all around for them, and then they're still wondering why it's taken them like 6 months to a year to kind of even get back to like baseline function. So how they approach one person in rehab versus the other, you're having to base things on what somebody's starting point is, right? So the process is just going to be a lot slower and a lot harder for that person. And the other factor that we deal with is what we talk about, unloading. So when you unload a muscle, whether you're young or old, it does not stick around very long.
So what's that mean real quick, unloading?
Unloading, right? So if you get injured, so you're loaded right now. If you're not injured, right, you can walk around, you're fine. You're mechanically loading all the time, and then you're loading even more when you go to the gym. If whether you go on bed rest or like, let's say like me back in right before December, I tore my quad, and then that limb becomes unloaded, particularly when you're talking about the legs, the lower extremities that are used to being loaded all the time. Muscle's pretty expensive metabolically to keep around. And your body's trying to conserve energy and be efficient in the best way it can. So it's saying, if I'm not using this, why am I going to have protein synthesis going on if I'm not going to use it? So you can see, so you pair that with a bunch of inflammation paired with secondary inflammation, potentially from a surgery. And it's like, it's kind of like nuking your muscle. Oh my God. We'll see in 2 weeks, you can see somebody lose an athlete, like following an ACL reconstruction. In like 2 weeks, you can see somebody lose up to 1.5 kilos of lean mass in their quad.
Oh my God.
That's how
crazy.
That's how fast it goes. And it takes longer to recover it back. So when we talk about unloading, that's why for older folks, one of the biggest issues we see, hold on one moment. Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why one of the biggest issues with older folks, when they go heavy unloaded, particularly with like, say, some kind of hip fracture, it's pretty devastating. And we often think about like, here's what's going on with that person's hip. It's like, no, what's going to be going on with that person's entire life? Because it's going to have like a lot of negative repercussions for their metabolism, for their functional capacity, all this stuff. And at that age, how are they going to get that back? So you actually see a high mortality rate following, within years of somebody having an injury like that. So it's every time I'm talk to somebody who's kind of getting up there in age, like, well, I don't really do that much weight training anymore, I'm trying to do this and that and the other. It's like, no, that's completely the wrong idea. It's not that we're saying you need to go do something dangerous, but you should be stressing yourself and putting some strain to where you have stimulus to hold on to that more. So yeah, that's kind of like so that's kind of the long and short of that. And then when we talk about nutrients, this is a question I get asked a lot. It's unfortunately, when we talk about supplements, that's where things get like really weird in the United States. Should I, and the thing I'll always tell everybody is the best thing that anybody can do if you're trying to get more protein, before you are drinking a shake, before you're taking some sort of like additional supplement, eat food. It's the thing that your body is most going to be able to be used to. And the problem with a lot of these things, these supplements that come out, is the FDA doesn't regulate any of this. The only thing they regulate is whether or not it's going to be harmful to you. But I could take a bunch of like really low quality protein and filler. I can put whatever I want on the side of the carton and say, yeah, it's got 45 grams of this and it's got this many BCAAs. But even your best selling brands in the United States are pretty shoddy compared to what they're advertising. I was at experimental biology one year. It's a conference, and somebody had actually taken like the top 5 brands in the United States, bought several different samples of their stuff from several different lots, meaning it wasn't all from one batch, and then tested it using something called a mass spectrometer to look at, is what they're advertising on the side actually in this. And I think the best one, I don't remember the brand, but the best one, this United States manufactured product, had half the BCAA content that it was advertising.
Wow.
And that,
right.
hence that's the which is like the general, like that's kind of like the one of the indicators, like the quality of the protein. So I always tell folks that, the best thing you can do is eat food. So it's just the problem that most Americans have. And why do I say that? Because if you can get protein in throughout the day in large enough quantities, meaning for younger adults, usually somewhere between 20 to 30 grams per sitting, you're going to be constantly kind of hitting those anabolic pathways. Not to the point where, now there is an upper limit to that. So everybody who's like, I need to be eating like 400 grams of protein a day. It's like, well, probably not. There's a limit to what you can absorb. And it just sounds like you're throwing away money and pissing out a lot of what you're eating, because your kidneys are processing all the overflow of amino acids. So I generally stick to if you're eating a gram per pound body weight, that's more than enough for anybody. But split throughout the day, those are that paired with resistance training, we know is going to kind of give you the best benefit. That's why I always think it's interesting, this whole fad of intermittent fasting lately, because essentially what you find with extreme intermittent fasting is like, yeah, it's a pretty okay weight loss. If you're trying to lose weight, that's one thing, because all you're doing is restricting your eating window to 4 to 6 hours in the day, and your body's not. And so even if you ate like 3,000 calories in 4 to 6 hours, which would be horrible, just to do,
just feel bloated all day or for a couple hours.
You're not absorbing a lot of that, and yeah, you're losing. You're still in a calorie deficit, so you're gonna lose weight, but because you're not pinging those anabolic those anabolic pathways every couple of hours, you'll lose just as much muscle as you're losing fat. So that people get enamored with that, because they're like, well, I'm losing all this weight, and it's like, yeah, but it's probably a better idea to do things like at least getting that protein throughout the day. And then if you want to save your carbohydrates and fats for certain windows of time, like personally, that's the other aspect I hate. I don't know about you guys, but I can't stand training on an empty tank. Like it just makes, it's like, we talk about fasted cardio and fasted training, you're burning more fat. Well, that's not what it's about. It's about, at the end of the day, did you burn more than you consumed net? Is your net a deficit or is it a gain? Because it's just like the person who says, well, I eat all healthy foods. It's like, yeah, but if you eat 3,500 calories of healthy foods and you only burn 3,000 calories, you're still in an excess. You're still going to gain weight. Same thing. It's a math problem. So anybody, for everybody says, well, it's not all about the macros. Well, I mean, it is heavily about the macros. I'm not saying other things don't have an impact, but it certainly is a big part of it. If I at the end of my week, if I'm at a net loss of 2,000 calories, I've lost weight. So the key is we want most of that weight to be fat. Now, typically, if I'm going to go, work out, I'll get some carbohydrate in just because I want some fuel in my muscles to use. The key is if I'm not working out till 5 p.m., do I need to wake up and eat like a bowl of Cinnamon Toast Crunch if I'm just going to be sitting in my office like this for the next 6 hours? Probably not. Because it's, particularly if you're talking about simple sugars, I always tell people, think about that like your rocket fuel. And if you don't use it like right then, you are kind of going to go into a storage mode, and you're going to start causing these insulin spikes to happen. And which, if you're talking about around your resistance training session, maybe getting like 200 calories right before you go in to give yourself some energy, and then getting some carbohydrate and protein and fat right after your session to kind of pull it all together and maximize your response. That's probably the way to go. I also, so that's just generally how people think about that. Everybody kind of focuses in. I just generally say, when folks tell me I do this diet or that diet or this diet, if it's called this diet, somebody's trying to sell you something.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of rewind a second there, because I get asked a lot about my diet. And, I went to a nutritionist when I started out, Keith Klein, back in Houston. And, I just followed his program. I stuck with it and didn't really question it. And it gave me tremendous success. Eat 6 times a day, have balanced meals, whole foods are preferred. If you need to, 1 shake a day is the most you want to do. But I get asked a lot about intermittent fasting, and you went into the difference between the caloric deficit or the ability to have a caloric deficit. Just because you're narrowing your window, you're less inclined to overeat throughout the day when you're stuffing your face for those 4 to 6 hours. So I kind of want to touch up on that again, to where you talked about how I don't remember the exact words you used, but it was like that muscle protein synthesis or whatever, where you're not signaling your body to absorb that protein properly because you're only eating in such a short window of time. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I feel like, that's a very important detail that a lot of people, when looking at the diets, are overlooking. Like when you compare a bodybuilder, they're eating 6 times a day or more. When you're looking at some guy that's just, trying to lose weight, but they don't realize the repercussions.
Right.
I think that comparison is important.
Yeah, I think, so basically, you only have when you take in nutrients, that's going to have an effect for just a few hours. Okay. So if I'm taking in a protein source, you'll see a spike in amino acids in your bloodstream, and then it'll kind of trickle down over the next couple of hours because you're absorbing it. And as that spike right there, you get a lot of talk about one of our BCAs we talk about is leucine, and there's there are sensing mechanisms in muscle that turn on when they sense those things coming in to keep things going. So your goal is, throughout the day, you want to kind of be pinging that multiple times. But there's an upper limit to that. Like, you can only synthesize so much protein. You can only ramp that up so much at once. So if I way overshoot it, I don't gain any benefit from that. All I've done is just kind of, again, that the term I use, I've just flooded my engine for that period of time. And so people like that they're losing weight because they're in a net deficit, but it's ideal, which is better than, if you're in a little bit of a deficit, it's better than being in a huge excess. So if it's preventing that, that's great, but you're not maximizing what you're doing. You're kind of just gaming the system to where you're still causing a deficit at the end of the day, but what you're losing, you want most of what you lose to be fat, right? You're not trying to lose total tissue, unless somebody, say, in a weight class based sport or something like wrestling or something like that, where that is what it's about. You're literally just trying to cut weight to make weight. But yeah, that for most people, I would say that's a big issue. And for what we see a lot in our older adults, as well as, and just Americans in general, have a habit of backloading their protein towards the end of the day and not getting enough in the morning. So somebody might wake up and they might have a bagel or something in the morning, which you're pretty much just getting carbohydrates and maybe some fat. And then it's not even until like lunch or the afternoon when they're getting that first like protein intake going on. And then usually that only goes up further towards the end of the day. So you generally see this shift that happens when in reality, it's probably better to be a little bit more balanced throughout the day. But if you are trying to partition things because you're specifically trying to be a little bit more low carbohydrate or things like that, I also tell people, think about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are great. People shouldn't be afraid of them. It's just you need to time them where you need them, right? So again, if I'm just coming to work and I'm sitting here working on papers or just kind of walking around the lab, I don't need a whole lot of carbohydrate fuel. If I have my like 12-ounce cup of coffee in the morning and I have like a Greek yogurt and maybe like a Greek yogurt and 2 hard-boiled eggs and maybe like a little BCAA shake, I got my 20 to 25 grams in, I got some fats in, and I'm going to feel fine. The hard part I find for most folks, it's really easy to get into the habit of. So the problem with a lot of that is carbohydrates, particularly simple sugars, are very addictive. Not just addictive like mentally, like I'm craving that. What happens is you see these spikes and troughs in someone's blood sugar that go up and down, and you get these insulin spikes. You get that nice dopamine rush, and your metabolism kind of gets used to that. And so it for some people, it takes like several days to a few weeks to get them to where like they say, well, I'm so hungry. It's like my stomach is screaming at me. And you're just trying to explain, it's just going to take a couple of days for your blood sugar to level out and for things to calm down and for you to resensitize yourself. I was on that note, that is hard for, I always say the math is easy on weight loss. Like the math is really easy. It's not for anybody who's like, it's so hard. I'm not eating anything and I'm exercising all the time and like I'm burning all these calories. I'm hardly eating anything. My comment to them is like, well, you're lying. Like you're lying. There's more energy. If there's that much more energy being expended than being taken in and you're gaining weight, we need to go turn you into the physics department because we've discovered some sort of new matter that goes against the laws of the universe.
Yeah. Don't tell the CIA there.
Like there's so the addictive part of it. The hard thing is, so that the math is easy: eat less, move more, and you will lose weight. But to all like the gym people who are like, yeah, bro, it's so easy, man. They just got to follow the people. You got to understand like what those things for somebody who's been eating a certain way for like years and what their metabolism is used to. It is very, very difficult sometimes when you have your stomach just screaming at you and your energy levels going up and down, going haywire. We'll literally see patients with our weight management group across the street. Well, they'll tell you it's like I'm inside my head watching myself make myself do, and it's like and it is hard. And the way I would put it is, unlike, say, if you're an addict to cocaine or heroin or whatever, those are things where like you can get treatment and then you don't have to put that in your body anymore. For someone who battles with like food stuff, it's like you're constantly you have to eat to live. So you're constantly having to engage with this thing that you're trying to fight against, like for the rest of life.
So let's talk about that a little bit. A lot of people, I think right now culturally Adderall is probably the most abused drug. And I think
vitamins and stimulants in general.
Yeah. And a symptom of that is also, I mean, it was designed to, if memory serves, that was designed as like an appetite suppressant, as like a diet pill that then got used.
Those kind of, that class of drugs in general has been used from everything from like, the mental aspects of it, as well as the appetite suppressive stuff. And that's the other issue we see sometimes is you'll have, say, somebody who threw out their like elementary school, middle school, high school, and college life, maybe they were prescribed something like that. They were taking it chronically. Their whole metabolism got used to a set point on that, and mentally they could deal with that. And then maybe as they get into adulthood, they come off of it because maybe they've either learned to deal with it, or they don't need it as much. And they'll be like, why am I gaining all this weight? And it's like, now you don't have this thing that's this external thing driving your metabolism. You probably have lifelong consequences for being on that for X amount of years, and now you're having to deal with that. That's why it's interesting where we're seeing all these products like Wegovy and Ozempic, and like that's the new hot thing now, is these kind of like weight loss things that were designed originally as like anti-diabetic medications, that we're now seeing celebrities just like buy like crazy and get backdoor prescriptions to, because they think it makes them lose weight, because they have massive appetite suppressing capabilities.
Are those utilizing the same pathways that like the amphetamine hits?
These are like GLP-1 inhibitors. So essentially it makes your body not there's no like mental stimulus for you to eat.
Okay, got it.
Or you don't get like the same physiologic indicators like, hey, you are hungry, you are low on fuel, you need to go eat. So people just take this stuff. The problem again, the problem is the same there though. People end up losing just as much muscle as they do fat, unless they're doing something extreme. Unless they're doing like something extreme where they're like, blasting gear on top of that and then force feeding certain things. But for your average but see, that's the issue is, say like a celebrity or something buys it because they're like prepping to be skinny in a movie, or be thin for a couple of weeks so they can show up to the award show or be on Instagram. And then your average person's like, oh, well, I need to just go get on that. And so we have some docs that are abusively prescribing that stuff, and it's and unfortunately you have too many backdoor channels where people can go online and just buy things. It's like never been easier for people to just go buy whatever now.
Do you know any like natural remedies or supplements that aren't as extreme as those that may help people control their hunger?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that people don't think about is calorie density. So, and this isn't as easy as going and getting like, say, a pill that you take every day. But so for example, if I get like a low carb, like a big low carb tortilla and load it up with say like shredded lettuce or something, and then some chicken and a bunch of veggies, and then I wrap all that up and I eat that. That whole thing might only be 350 to 400 calories. And that's like that's like this, right? So that's like that big. That's going to give your stomach a sense of being full. And that's going to also take a little bit longer to process. There's also a lot of things that are good from the vegetables, fiber, things like that. Versus if I go and have like, say, a king size, that's that much food that's going to go in your stomach. If I go get, say, like a king size Snickers bar that's by size way smaller, right? And I eat that, it'll have the same amount of calories, but I'm going to process that so fast, my stomach's not going to feel like it was full, and I'm going to be hungry again in like 15 to 20 minutes. So you'll have somebody say like, hey, somebody will say, well, I feel like it's like I'm eating nothing. It's like, well, if you actually look at how many calories were in that, it's quite a few. And it's just, I think that's one of the, and then there are certain foods that keep you a little more satiated compared to others. Foods that have just low calorie dense foods. That's the way I describe it. Like, for example, Like Greek yogurt's a good example of a low calorie dense food that also is high in protein. There's a number of other
I love I love my yogurt, and I think there's a big fitness influencer. I'm not gonna remember who it was. Maybe it's Cali Muscle, who had a bunch of health issues, and now he's been uh pitching this watermelon is like the secret food that you can eat a ton of and fill yourself up on. I don't know if I subscribe to it, but I've seen a kick with that now. A lot of people are eating tons and tons of watermelon.
Yeah, but like it's just eat in balance. It's like there's no reason to do these extreme dumb things.
Yeah.
This is also coming from the same guy who used to eat like 4 packs of ramen noodles, cover it in salt, and then like say, yeah, this is what I, it's whatever whatever extreme thing people can do at the time. But the hard thing is that, so I think the other hard part is when people find these like healthy, low calorie dense foods, is they find like 6 things and they only ever eat that. And the way people say it's restrictive, and the way I would say it's the other way around. If you actually explore and kind of learn, you'll find a ton of foods that you can kind of get into, and it actually like brings you into this whole like new area of, and there's plenty of ways people can make versions of foods that they like that have just healthier properties to them. So for example, my kids every Saturday want to eat waffles. So what do I need? So sometimes I'll just take like, instead of just using the straight pancake mix, maybe I'll do just like 1 scoop of that, and then I'll put like a couple of scoops of whey protein, add like 3 or 4 eggs, stuff like that. So I have these where you eat 1 waffle and it's not that many calories, but you're like super filled up, and you got, so that's just an example of.
But it tastes better too.
Right. Well, I mean, this is an example of ways people can kind of like go out and just discover different things. I think, what's his name? Even though he's like the Gilbert Gottfried of fitness, and he's just absolutely absurd and ridiculous. But for example, guys like Greg Doucette,
yeah, that's what I was gonna guess.
who like have their cookbooks and stuff like that. So that people can go find all that stuff. It's just hard. But I think the part where people will get on those diets for like 2 or 3 months and then want to bail, it's just because they get sick of it. They just get sick of it. And the other issue is, I think too many people are following bodybuilders these days. When you're talking about, we're not taught. Everybody thinks that like, you know what, I'm gonna just go hardcore on this for 3 to 4 months. I'm gonna lose all this weight and then I'll be happy. And it's like, no, dude. Do you think those guys are happy? Like, right? They're happy on Instagram, sure. When they're happy when they're flexing out, but when they're getting that like week before peak week or whatever, it's like the worst.
Oh my God.
It's like the worst they're gonna feel. Not to mention their organs are starting to shut down, and then they do this big rebound after they. So what you're actually seeing in that area more and more is you're starting to see less of this like bulk cut thing, and people are getting a lot more like, I'm just gonna try to stay about 10 weeks out in terms of like 10 to 15 weeks out in terms of just my general appearance year round, and just eat healthier throughout. And so but so many people are like, well, I'm like going to follow this prep. I'm going to follow this bodybuilding prep diet. And that's miserable. That's not a way to live.
If someone's natural, because a lot of these guys are enhanced, if someone's natural and they're trying to do that, keep that, what they're walking around probably 10-12% body fat if they're looking 10 weeks out to cut down. Is that really optimal for muscle building, or is there a lot coming from those?
It depends on the person. So the way I would say it is, so visually, if somebody feels like they're 10 to 15 weeks out, and there's a couple of signs you got to look at right there. So for some people, when they drop under 15, so for some people when they drop under like say 15%, you start feeling this low energy. If you get 8 hours of sleep and you wake up and you have this low energy and lethargia, you don't feel like, monitoring what you're doing in the gym. If you're not able to achieve the same workloads, if you're constantly feeling run down, yeah, you're probably not getting enough. But that set point can be a little bit different for everybody. We got some of these guys here that are offensive linemen that, big, strong guys, maybe 20% is fine for them, where they can kind of optimize things. But it's also about knowing kind of where your caloric maintenance point is too. So I find that most people can handle a weekly caloric, being in a daily caloric deficit of about 300 to 500 calories. If you're trying to go like a deficit of like 1,000 calories by like day 3 or 4, you're starting to feel pretty bad. And the problem is you get to where people will do that throughout the week and then go ham on the weekend and not understand that at the end of that whole week, maybe you weren't in as much of a deficit as you thought, because then you binged out all over the weekend. And then I would say, if somebody's kind of been operating at that 300 to 500 calorie deficit, you do after a couple of weeks start feeling a little run down. Well, one of the reasons I like wearing they're not completely accurate, but one of the reasons I like wearing my Garmin is, or you can do this with Apple Watch too, just having a general idea of how many calories am I burning per day. And then not just relying on one day, but like looking at the whole week's worth of stuff. Say, okay, on an average day, I'm burning about 3,200 calories. And then just kind of and then at eating, say 2,800, by the end of the week, if I'm starting, after like a month, if I'm starting to feel a little run down, okay, well, maybe this next week, I'm just going to eat at maintenance. I'm just going to eat at 3,200 a day, so I can kind of recover a little bit. And that's what kind of, the hard part. Everybody says counting calories is hard. It's not hard. It's addition. It's not difficult. So it's just people don't want to do it because they want to keep lying to themselves about like, hey, that was pretty healthy. And so that's kind of, that would be my strategy, as opposed to, but then again, the other thing is, everybody understands that, genetics play a role in that too. There's some people who can walk around. Unfortunately, there are people who can walk around the earth and just be at 8% body fat, and that's just fine for them, and that's just how they are. Where those people actually have harder time gaining and putting on muscle than maybe somebody else does. But for some people, that's not the case, and that's fine. It's just
is there a test you could take to or something that you could turn to say, I want to know exactly what my body would be optimally for caloric intake? Like, is that just over time, learning to listen to your body, having that mind body connection? Or
some of it's over time. There, you can look at things like your resting heart rate over time to know, like, once you start getting stressed and you start like getting down into a too low of a standpoint, you start getting, men actually get similar symptoms as women do. There's a term called the female athlete triad, where it's a series of symptoms from over exercise and under nutrition, where it's like it's a syndrome that's not just overtraining, but it's under nutrition. So a couple of things, they have things like amenorrhea, which means you'll start skipping cycles. You'll start seeing the resting heart rate creep up. You'll start seeing just overall sense of stress, and anxiety and things like that. A similar thing happens to men. We just don't, there's not as many like physiologic indicators for it. But if you just have to be, and I think it's harder. That's why coaches, particularly for young athletes, are more important, because they don't know their body as well yet, right? They don't know how to identify all those symptoms, where I can generally tell if I'm starting to get run down, and then I take an accounting of like, okay, what have I been eating? What have I been doing? It's pretty, without even having to really calculate it out, you can tell. Another way to do that would be to look another way to kind of get an indicator on that is, if you really want to, you can go get a blood panel done. If you start seeing cortisol going up and you start seeing your testosterone crash, and you're starting, and if I do a resting metabolic rate test and I start seeing my metabolism starting to crash, those are all signs that like you're probably not getting enough. So it's kind of, so where's the best place to stay is kind of like right on the line of where you feel like you have enough energy to perform, you have enough energy to get through your daily tasks of work. When you go to sleep and you wake up, you feel okay, you feel pretty good. But you're not completely like run down.
Now I want to ask about the relationship between, because these men's clinics that everyone's talking about TRT and they're all getting on it, and it seems to be like really hitting like a exponential curve. I feel like how much, because I think if someone got their blood work done, because a lot of these men clinics will do that blood work, and they saw like high cortisol, metabolism crashing, testosterone crashing. I think more commonly right now, you'd hear someone say, "Oh, well, you need TRT or something," rather than we need to manipulate nutrition.
There's money to be made. And so what I would say to anybody who feels like they're in that scenario, particularly if you are if there's been a major diet change where you are restricting calories and things, and then you go and you're seeing things are low, I would say get some sleep, get some, change your sleep patterns and eat at maintenance for like 2 months, and then go back and retest that, get that rechecked. But people don't want to do that. People want to just, what the other thing that's being abused a lot right now is people will go buy stuff online that they know will cause them to crash. So when they go and get tested and show up as low, they'll get their prescription that they wanted. The doc has no idea what they took. They're just saying, "Oh, you're at this rate, so we should put you on this." On the opposite side of that, it's kind of sad because there are plenty of people, particularly after the age of like, once you start getting over kind of that like 35, 40 period, there are plenty of people who could benefit from that. We see a number of patients across the street who are kind of like borderline. It could be a it could be a non-surgical intervention surgery type injury that might heal on its own. It's just like a nagging thing that's been chronic. There are certain scenarios, and maybe they are a little bit on the low side. We are starting to look at things like maybe if that person might be a candidate, and that might keep them out of having to have surgery. It might keep them, reduce some of their inflammation, and they may benefit from it. The reason I say it's sad that it's taken this long is because there's been such a stigma associated with TRT that was never associated with things like estrogen replacement therapy, which has been a big deal. The reason that's taken so long to get popularized is that when estrogen replacement has been a big deal for like, over 20 years now. So, and the difference being that somebody thinking, the stigma being people not understanding that somebody's not blasting like 800 milligrams of test a week when they're just going and getting TRT. They're putting them at like, probably somewhere between 100 and 150 just to get them to like a normal physiologic level. So there are people who certainly can benefit from that. But yeah, I would say a lot of people jump the gun on whether or not they need to. And the later someone starts getting onto that, probably the better, but we still don't have enough. We don't have enough info to say that the general assumption is don't start doing any of that until it's like you are clinically in a range where you are low enough. So yeah.
So to that, because I noticed I've done some digging here, and so like I see a lot of people, and across the social medias I've seen this as well. Lots of people are saying, "Oh, you shouldn't do that because of concern, like a higher risk of heart disease and stroke and stuff like that." But the reason from what I saw, it didn't seem like it was very clear. And I'm also curious about, if you have someone who has low T, they have this inflammation, they have all the symptoms that go with it, how much is the trade-off going to be from them having more energy, doing more? Surely that kind of balances out, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's hard because if you're talking about somebody who's like overweight, obese, eating too much, has all these other comorbidities, and then they go on TRT and they're not like exercising, there's probably way more risk associated with that, because you can see one moment. Because you can see things like shifts up in somebody's LDL cholesterol, somebody's HDL cholesterol getting low. And those are the things that we worry about in terms of indicators for heart disease. If somebody's already hypertensive and has high blood pressure, that's a concern. If somebody's already has a high risk of, they already have other things that they're putting themselves at a higher risk for cancer, then that's a concern. The difference being, if somebody's being put at like physiologic normal levels of T, and then they go and are training hard and are exercising and eating right and doing with it, that's the point where these risks are like very, very much minimized. So you don't have, so somebody shouldn't walk into one of those clinics thinking like, well, I'm like overweight and out of shape, and this is the thing that's just going to do the work for me to get me. It's like, well, no, you're probably just now going to still have all these problems and maybe just a little bit more muscle, and maybe a little bit more energy. But the people who do that thinking like this is going to be the thing that's going to spur, like, get me to the next
miracle cure for them
thing. That's probably the biggest, one of the biggest misunderstandings of all of that.
Yeah. I see a lot of there's a TikTok trend. I don't know how much you look at TikTok, but there's the Tren challenge on TikTok where these 16, 17 teenagers are taking Tren for like a month and seeing how much muscle they can put on. And it's like
that stuff's so stupid, because what people don't, it's one thing if somebody's taking like taking a compound that naturally occurs in your body that your body's used to, that's one thing. When people are just blasting this shit, they're causing like irreparable harm potentially, particularly when they don't know what they're doing, which is most of these folks. But I know this guy on YouTube who told me this, that, and the other, or I follow this popular YouTube bodybuilding asshole who has their own podcast, who challenges UFC fighters to fight all the time, but because he said this, that, and the other, and what I can do, then they go and do it. And the problem is these guys that are doing this, they quite fancy having all of this attention and all of this stuff, but it's like you're just kind of being a predator on kids who are just hanging on your every word for all this stuff.
I think that a lot of that also comes from the fact that I feel like people look at bodybuilding as like, oh, these guys, like you mentioned earlier, there's like a health aspect, but this sport. There's nothing about health in this sport. This sport is not even close to being healthy. It's an extreme sport.
I would say at least now what you're seeing is that I'm kind of conflicted as to whether or not it's better or worse. You're seeing some of the guys that are being a little more transparent about what's going on and what they're doing, and so that's been good. But the problem is does that then, because there's more information out there, do people feel like they now have some sort of better knowledge base to do things? And so it's weird. And then so there's that, and then the hyper jump in all these research chemicals people are buying, because that's like the new thing. It's the new like gray area in people getting on supplements, is you can go online and buy stuff that says not for human consumption, research chemical, but it's clearly bottled in a way where it's meant to be for human consumption. but because it says that, they get around this gray area, and kids are going and buying all that stuff, and they're saying like, well, at least it's not as bad as this, at least it's not as bad as that. It's like it could be actually worse, in terms of the long term.
I was a biochem major, and I have a lot of experience in buying for research only. Different. For me, it was psychedelics from Canada, but which is completely legal, so I'm fine. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's extremely popular. So I want to
Real quick though, I should say on that note, the hard thing is, because those things are in a very like FDA gray area, there are probably compounds that could have a lot of clinical value and use, but because they're in the area they are, you'll never see a United States, I should say never, but it's very difficult to do like a United States like human clinical trial with the stuff, because it's not even something you can get like clearance to do in like a setting like this. So, and the reason that the companies that are doing that like that is because they get to keep it in this weird gray area where they can charge money for it, and it has a less likelihood of becoming some sort of like illegal compound, which it might, depends on the country you're in terms of how strict they are on that stuff. But yeah, it's unfortunate, because there's probably several of these things that might be of interest, but for the average person who's trying to do, you're talking about for the average person who there's no reason to like go down that road.
Do you think a lot of those things should be illegal, or how do you think that should be handled?
Well, see, that's the hard part. You need to do like clinical trials and clinical studies to actually determine all of that. Now, some of them I know plenty of them are listed as, plenty of these things are listed as PEDs and banned by like the NCAA and banned by like USADA and WADA and all that. But in terms of like using them therapeutically, it's one of those things where you do see some clinics are able to do things like like peptide therapies and stuff, like whether you're talking about like often paired with like TRT, is people will prescribe things like HCG, and that's been long used for like infertility clinics for men, but for some of these things, it's like because it's impossible to do clinical trials on them, it's hard. The medical community can't really say one way or the other.
Okay, yeah. So I want to switch off a little bit. I feel like we've got a good dive on that topic. But are you familiar with Bryan Johnson at all across the social medias?
That sounds familiar.
He's I think he's been called the fitness vampire, but he is a former tech billionaire, sold his company.
Oh,
and
yes,
spends tons.
This
okay.
Guy. Yes,
yeah.
I know who you're talking about. Yep, this guy. I think what he's doing is interesting. The part that's interesting to me, one of the I think what he's doing is interesting. This I don't buy into he's not that much older than me, and to me, he certainly doesn't look like he's preserving a whole lot of that like young look, if that's what he's going for.
Yeah.
But I like that he's got into this idea of like using wearable devices and a lot of monitoring and just investigating a lot of these kind of like therapies. And the argument could be made that's like no person is going to spend $2 million a year on this stuff. Like it's kind of, I think that was like the price tag they listed on what he's doing. And his comment back is, we're more trying to explore what works and what doesn't, so we can kind of like pare things down to what made whenever it is that I'm done with all of this, or whenever it is that I die, we will have been able to hopefully pare it down to here were the things that made the biggest difference, that we can then make a little more publicly available or work on, like, so I like what he's doing. The other thing that I have interest in, one of the areas is, this idea that I don't know if it's kind of a funny experiment where he like got a blood transfusion from some of his kids' blood. And those kind of things. There's a lot of interest I have in that, because when you exercise, for example, particularly when you're young, you have a lot of factors that get released from muscle. So your muscle acts as much of an endocrine organ as it does. Muscle can act like an endocrine organ. It excretes things that have a physiologic effect in other parts of your body. It acts as an autocrine organ on itself, and paracrine, where you're talking about next neighbor signaling. So some of the stuff that gets released has very good properties for healing. There's a lot of interest I have in things like extracellular vesicles that can get released and go have positive effects on other areas of the body. We know there've been studies done in rodents where if you can transfuse blood from a rat where you've just caused a bunch of contractions to have, simulating exercise, and put that on cancer cells, the same serum or plasma, you actually can halt and highly reduce the size of tumors. So that area is just interesting to me, because we know that we have a whole lot of that stuff that goes on. So the idea being that, like, I kind of have this funny thought, like, should we all be like banking our, maybe like a couple times a year go and do a hard bout of like cycling or running or weightlifting, and then pull off a pint and put it in the bank for when I'm older and want some rejuvenation.
That is really interesting, and that is probably also the gateway to these conspiracies about billionaires drinking baby blood. But
there's probably some of that.
Yeah, but that is really interesting. So
I think a lot of what he's doing, I think there's merit. For him, for example, though, the parts that are absurd to me is he does this, like, I eat one time a day and I eat in the morning, and that's like that's like counterintuitive to me from a health standpoint, because he's basing not everything, but so much of what he does, he's basing around his resting heart rate or his heart rate reserve, which he's like, well, my resting heart rate's at like 48 beats per minute. I'm like, yeah, but like, when I'm pretty well trained, my resting heart rate sits around like 53, 54, and I'm not doing it 90% of the 99% of the stuff that he's doing. So to pin it on how he's getting his indicators for health based on some of the variables, I'm not saying are completely incorrect. I would just need to have like a pretty in-depth conversation with him and his team to see what exactly how they're basing that on, because he commonly refers to optimizing things based on what his resting heart rate is and things like that. So yeah. I'd be like, where are you pulling some of these metrics from that you're saying like this was the best thing to use as your barometer? Because I follow a podcast by Lex Friedman, and he asked him a question. He was like, yeah, but how much of a life is that if like your whole day is situated around like and stressing about like, am I doing this optimal thing? He's like, sometimes after you finish a project or you get done with something, or maybe you had to like power through all night and chugging coffee, and there's a mental reward and release for that, so
yes.
So I'd say like, yeah, it's like, do you want to live miserably till 130, or or would it be maybe a better goal to be like, maybe I wanted to make it to like 105 and I had a kick-ass time?
Yeah. I think that was first of all, I have a decent amount of skepticism towards some of the markers he's using to attribute to being technically in good health. And then my biggest skepticism is like, dude, who else but a total psycho like you is actually going to follow this crazy regimen you have? It's so far out ridiculous to maybe be a few points healthier.
Right. It's the same thing. Yeah. It's the same thing for kids who are basing like their entire self-worth on how they appear on Instagram. And even when I talk to like like college age dudes, it's like, look, no girl cares if you look like Bumstead. They don't. They just don't. They don't care.
Well, I don't know. Bumstead, maybe another bodybuilder there, but joking.
But my point with that is, as long as you're like, you generally look well put together, like you at least think about how you take care of yourself, and you're not an asshole. That's like the starting point. Like past that, they're not asking for you to be much more than that. And if they are, that should probably be a huge red flag for that particular chick, you know?
Yeah.
If or same thing for the other side. Like if you're no dude should be like, I want my gal to look like she's about to be in like the next fitness competition. That's my requirement for even walking in the door to date this person. It's like that guy is probably the red flag, that mentality. So but it's just weird how people get like, and just like health with Bryan Johnson, it's like you can overanalyze these things to the point of just paralysis. And or just like just like you see an old person who like you ever go to like somebody's grandparents' house and they've got like a whole tub of like all the supplements and pills that they take because they saw in some infomercial that if they eat this and eat this and eat that, and it's like that's it, which is kind of goes back to the Bryan Johnson thing. He's taking like 100 to 150 pills a day. Is that something that anybody wants to do? Probably not.
Yeah. No, that was the first thing that really was a red flag to me. Is there's a lot of benefits to actually chewing your food and not getting everything in through a pill and liquid form, from my understanding, which is probably nowhere near the extent of even his or yours, but my intuition tells me that's probably a bit off. But yeah, I agree. But so I want to finish up. How are we doing on time, by the way? How much time do you have?
I got about 10 minutes for you.
10 minutes? Okay.
Yeah,
so all right. So I'm gonna ask a personal question. I am currently peaking pretty well right now for my lifts. I just hit creeping up at like a 400-pound bench, and my deadlifts and my squat are going up. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what is the most optimal way for me to recover from these heavy lifts as I am starting to peak towards those goals, those big PRs?
So as you're trying to hit those, you have to make sure you're tapering a little bit. So that's the hardest thing. So many people overtrain so much. And I'm not saying you got to go into that, like, is it Mike Mentzer? The old like Arnold competitor who he used to, like, they used to back. He would, I'm not saying you have to go into that. His philosophy was like, well, I only have to train like 3 or 4 days a week for 30 minutes, and that's all I need. And it's like, you probably need more than that. But like, it's the time where it's not the time to go ham on these the auxiliary lifts. It's not the time to be doing all of those things to failure. Leaving like 3 or 4 reps in the tank. Obviously good sleep. And then I usually take a week where I'm doing like walkouts and like prep pulls, and you're working on your approach, you're building sets, but you're not trying to hit the PR then. And then, or I might even do a walkout with a squat where it's like, 30, 40 pounds heavier than what I'm trying to go for, but then just put it back on the rack.
We were talking about that the other day.
Depending on how close you're getting, there's long progressions by this guy named Dave Tate, one of the best with the West Side Barbell guys. He's got some of the best like progressions for benching and squatting, how to get into that. And if you look at his programs, you're like, wait, there's only like 4 lifts on here, because it's just very basic stuff. But he does a lot of things involving, like, so for example, bench press, like progressing from working on like floor pressing, towel pressing, things where or on squat, using accommodating resistance. So you mean like doing like pause squats where you have chains to load the top end, things like that. Deadlift is a whole nother thing. It's like the most perishable lifting skill, I feel like.
What do you mean by that?
So meaning if you're not practicing it regularly, it's a skill that can drop off because there's a lot of timing that goes into when you're firing what. So some things where you're working, like maybe you are working on like a pin pull, or a pull off of, say, like an elevated pull, where you're doing a pull where you're like a negative pull, almost like you're standing
on a plate or something.
Yeah, something like that, where you're not, just to put yourself in a little bit of a different range of motion. But if you're talking about like trying to be like 2 or 3 weeks out from doing a PR, the best thing is really just rest. Still getting your training sessions in, practicing your approach sessions, trying to calculate out. This is the problem that where people miss a lot of PR attempts, is they didn't calculate their approaching sets well. Like they either took too many, so they're tired by the time that they're going there, or they took too few and they're making too fast of a jump. And there's not any like 100% set percentage for that. It's something that you kind of have to like, really, I would say if you're not able to hit that PR within like, getting close within like 7 or 8 sets, it's you're probably using too much energy. You've probably kind of pre-gassed yourself out. Bench press is a little bit different one, because there's so many different there's a lot of like there are some different mechanics things that can happen there. How's the heel drive off the floor? How's the tuck? How are all of those things? Sometimes even doing the one thing I think you could be careful with, that I think a lot of people overuse, is like doing heavy negatives. Particularly like if it's like the week before you're going for a PR, because when you're doing heavy lifting, what people don't think about is you might not be as sore like from muscle damage or muscle fatigue, but you can look up the term neural fatigue. You're having to send a lot of signal down those motor units from your brain. And it's almost, think about it like this. It's like if you lift super heavy for a lot of weeks in a row, your circuits kind of get a little bit fried. And so sometimes you might need a week or two to reset, where you might only go in the gym once or twice. Just go through like your first couple of warm-up sets and try to just put them up at a little velocity, and then walk out of the gym and then get out of there. And that's
hard. That's hard to do.
It's an ego thing.
All right. So what's a drug that'll calm my ego down? Just kidding.
It is hard. It is hard to do, because like you're like the mentality of like, it's like if I'm not lifting all the time and I'm not lifting heavy, it's just going to make things, I'm not going to get as much out of it. So yeah, that if you're going for PRs and you're going for ones and stuff like that, it's the recovery aspect is just killing that volume, particularly in like the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to it, and really just thinking less on like you're working a muscle, you're practicing a movement. So that's different than like I'm isolating a bicep curl and going for the pump and I'm doing my sets of 12 to 15 to like, that's different. Compared to training a movement and really focusing on mechanics, making sure everything feels like you're pushing from a solid base. There's no pain happening. All of that kind of stuff. Because I feel it sometimes too, like if I'm kind of getting out of whack, it's almost like getting the shanks in golf, where like you've been squatting heavy for a while and then all of a sudden your form just feels kind of off. Something feels like you're hitching weird when you come up. You're rounding your back a little bit when you're pulling from the floor. You're not trying to, but something's like kind of off. And that's some of the first signs that like, okay, I need to like, and then what I say after those PRs are hit, take like a few weeks after that, where you're going lighter and like doing things like pause reps and really just focusing on, you still work more reps in, but you're just really hyper focusing on getting the form back and getting your mechanics in line. Because going heavy for a while, people just start gunning for it, and then stuff just starts getting off. When you're benching, something hitches that way, or when you're, like I said, those, all that kind of stuff can happen. And it throws off the timing, and some of that's due to neural fatigue. Your motor units are just firing all weird, and you need to kind of reset things.
All right, that's awesome. That's great advice.
Yeah, it's the advice that no young dude ever wants to hear, is train less.
Yeah.
Well, it's a tough one to take on.
Thanks so much for your time, Brad. If anyone wants to check out your research or learn more about you, where can they kind of look up some of your info or learn more?
So for right now, the best place to look at the studies that I've worked on, if you just search my name, Brad Lambert, there's a page that I use a lot called ResearchGate, researchgate.net, or just to search the Department of Orthopedics and Sports Medicine at Houston Methodist Hospital. Those are probably the two best places to get my stuff. And you guys are welcome to share the link that I sent you guys that has all my research stuff on it.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll do. I'll do for viewers on YouTube. It'll be down in the description as well and in the comments. So awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Brad. Really appreciate it. I'd love to have you get on in the future. It kind of there's a few topics I would like to dive more in, but I know we're limited on time.
Yeah,
this was a ton of fun.
Yeah, if you guys want to do another one, yeah, sure. We'll get into some of the rehab stuff, some of the sport performance stuff. So yeah, just let me know.
Awesome. All right. Well, you both have a great day. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Thank you, Brad.
No problem.